There are so many new laws and regulations that are related to cybersecurity.
The federal government, and starting from the White House and then every one of the three-letter agencies that makes up the Washington, D.C. alphabet soup, is kind of looking at this issue now and proposing solutions for how to tackle it. But the problem is when you have so many people trying to take a bite at the apple, it can get very confusing who you should listen to for this, who's going to come out on top.
Overall, there's a lot more requirements about reporting out about cybersecurity to regulators. You may be a very compliant company. You may have the right processes and the right policies, but being able to demonstrate that compliance to a regulator is not an easy task.
The regulations provide you with the opportunity to have a better and clear understanding of the things you need to put priority on, the things that you need to decide, should I put more resources, should I put more funding towards?
I come to this from a privacy point of view, which is a place where we've seen these kind of issues come before. We know what it's like to have to reconcile different viewpoints, but recognize that at the end of the day, you have to put your chips down on one approach and how it's going to be best done.
The new cybersecurity regulations creates an environment to have continuous compliance.
Customers and consumers and investors want to know your risk profile relative to data and cybersecurity. That's the new world that we're living in.
Please welcome Mel Dale, Chris Boyer, Adam Hickey, and Ron Green.
Who's having a good time at the conference so far? Everyone? All right, well, we're going to put a stop to it. So you've already reached the high point of the day. All right, this is actually a really super exciting panel. I'm honored to be here with this trust mind here to talk about something incredibly important, our new regulatory environment. There's a lot that has happened this year. So we continue to see threats, as we all know, scattered spider with the Caesar MGM incident, the Move IT issues, and ransomware, continues to be prolific. We are starting to see some major changes at the state and national level. In March, the National Cybersecurity Strategy came out. And I know that that's been mentioned a few times today, but just to highlight what those pillars are in that National Cybersecurity Strategy. 1, defend critical infrastructure. 2, disrupt and dismantle threat actors. 3, shape market forces to drive security and resilience. 4, invest in a resilient future. And finally, 5, forge international partnerships to pursue shared goals. So some really strong pillars and really strong call to action that all of us in this room have. From there, we're starting to see a lot of regulations and standards emerging, trying to react to this call to action. In July, we saw the Security and Exchange Commission, the SEC, they issued their final rule requiring public companies to do 2 things. 1, provide enhanced and standardized disclosures regarding cybersecurity risk management, strategy, and governance. And then on top of that, also report cyber incidents within 4 days after determination of materiality. The Department of Homeland Security also is working on establishing their final rule, set to be launched probably next year, early next year. So we're here really to talk about what this new environment looks like, how we navigate it, where we really have gone from an environment much more of the carrot, hence the name of the panel, more of a voluntary compliance to really these mandated regulations, and that's what we're here to discuss. So I'm going to start with Adam. And Adam, so what has changed? And in your opinion, why now?
Sure. Thanks for the question. Hello, everyone. I'm Adam Hickey. I'm a partner at Mayer Brown. Prior to this, I worked at the Justice Department for a little over a decade. And when I began working on national security cyber cases at that time, so 2012, I think the federal government viewed cybersecurity similar to how it viewed natural disasters and physical security, which is to say, companies were by and large trusted to make judgments about how to secure their premises, how much to spend on it, what steps to take. And if something happened, the government would by and large be in support mode. It would also be fairly reactive. And what I did was investigate attacks and try to attribute them and hold people accountable. That is not the world we live in right now, as you described. The consensus view, I think, among Washington policymakers is that that has failed. that market forces do not lead people to invest enough in security. And perhaps the reason for that is that the costs of security failures are not borne by decision makers. They're borne by the public. They're borne by school boards that can't start class on time, and they're borne by hospitals that have to take systems offline and the like. And so pillar 3 of that strategy, I think, is the most interesting to me. It calls out, in kind of a law and economics way, a desire to shift the costs more onto decision makers and force, whether we're talking about software vendors, hardware manufacturers, or companies, force them to internalize more of the costs of a failure of security. And if you make security comparatively less expensive than insecurity or comparable, you'll drive incentives to make things more secure. Okay, so how does this play out in the policy world? Well, first and foremost, disclosure. We don't have a lot of tools in the federal government, but one thing we can make people do is report things. So you see a proliferation of requirements to tell your regulator, tell the public, tell DHS. And I think the theory behind, A, it's legally viable in a lot of cases, and 2, I think the theory is that shame will drive people to do things better. And you don't want to lie in your SEC filing, so if you say you have robust governance, well, then you better have it, because otherwise then you have a process failure and potential liability. Second change is an increased call for liability, which I think you would not have seen a few years ago. It's now spoken about openly as a goal. And this is particularly for software vendors. Third, an emphasis on prescriptive cyber regulation. So moving from process, you should have a process, a plan, to you actually should have multi-factor authentication, should have this, that, and the other thing. Government for a while was reluctant to tell you how to secure your network. They're becoming more comfortable with that and leveraging things like NIST standards to do it, especially in the procurement process where they have the most leverage. And fourth, and perhaps of most interest to this group, an emphasis on accountability and consequence, and in particular, personal accountability. So a movement towards holding companies responsible under the False Claims Act, for example, if there's a breach and it points to a contradiction between their contract with the government and the security they had. An effort to try to deter individuals by holding individuals accountable, whether that's through criminal prosecution after the fact, or through civil suits or FTC orders that follow a CEO for 10 years of his career. Why now? To be very simplistic, I would say colonial pipeline. I think it's more complicated than that, but I think that was the first moment I think the government saw physical effects of a cyber attack in the form of fuel shortages, but also sort of panic, right? A failure to appreciate what the actual consequences were, and so the tilt of the public towards anxiety. And when something breaks in the physical world and the effects are no longer on the company's network, that has electoral consequences. So that is, in my personal view, why you've seen the policy apparatus move towards increasing regulation.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And it's kind of building on Adam's point. That's the other thing that's happened. So Colonial was definitely a tipping point. I've been representing AT&T in the process in DC, the public-private partnership process, for over a decade. And there was a lot of voluntary efforts, adopt the NIST framework and those types of things. But ever since Colonial, the whole conversation has shifted to being more about what are the prescriptive things that companies should have to do. And I think the way the government looks at it is they're trying to raise the bar for security. So they're not really going after companies that have very sophisticated security programs. But there are companies out there, I think, like Colonial and others, who probably should be doing more on security. So the goal from the government side is to raise the bar and kind of bring them up to some basic level. And then more recently, we've had a lot of concern being expressed about critical infrastructure security, and that ties back to, frankly, a lot of the things that you'll read about in the news that are going on in the world right now. A lot of concern around the ability of different nation states to be pre-deployed on critical infrastructure. There's a lot of concern about what's called Volt Typhoon and some of the issues that have happened in the past. And so the government wants to make sure that critical infrastructure owners and operators, which include companies like AT&T, but also big electric companies, other telecommunications companies, that they are prepared and capable of dealing with these attacks in the event that there is some sort of incident that happens down the road. And that is a big focal point right now in the government across the board.
So I'm actually going to stay with you, Chris. Next question. So what do you see as the biggest struggles when it comes to compliance with these new regulations? And then on the flip side of that, the enforcement of non-compliance.
I think the biggest issue with the biggest struggle we're going to have is just the sheer volume of them. There are a lot of different rules that are out there. Just on incident reporting alone, Adam mentioned the SEC. They have rules on incident reporting. If there's a material incident that affects your shareholders, you're supposed to report that. DHS is working on a proceeding right now where they're to implement what's called the Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity Reporting Act that was passed in 2022. So they're going to have reporting requirements. There are reporting requirements in New York State under the New York State Division of Financial Services. There's a new reporting requirements that are being proposed internationally. I could go off a litany of different entities that are now requiring cyber incident reporting, and so just there's a sheer volume of venues in which you have to report. The same thing for security baselines. You're seeing different baselines being proposed in different venues, and so those would be things like regulatory standards. So things like you have to do multi-factor authentication, using Adam's example, or other types of requirements, and they can get pretty granular as well. Some of them say things like you have to do multi-factor, or you have to have like a 12-character password, right? Things like that can get pretty specific. And I think there's a little bit of it's a challenge for business because a lot of folks will make, as you all know, you make decisions around when you design products and roll out services that you think are completely reasonable decisions on how you apply security. And now we have government coming in and saying, like, here's the very specific things you have to do with kind of a checklist approach, which is not how they've dealt with it in the past. So I just think overall the biggest challenge will be there's a number of different entities and venues where these regulations are coming out. They're not necessarily harmonized. You might see one requirement from one agency that might be different from another agency. So harmonizing all of that and making sure there's a consistent theme in dealing with the volume of them, I think will be the biggest issue. And then from a enforcement perspective, I think the challenge the government's going to have is there's different people look at these issues somewhat differently, so there's not a lot of consistency in that regard. Specifically, when I talk about the SEC proceeding, the SEC says, "Hey, look, you have to report something that's material," but there's a lot of disagreement on what material actually means in that context. That term is not well understood right now. So to what one person might think is a material issue that needs to be reported, another person might make a completely reasonable judgment that is different than what the agency might view it as. And so I think there's going to be quite a bit of, quite a few disputes around how that's interpreted when it comes to the SEC and other venues. So I think from an enforcement perspective, these are relatively nascent rules. It's a very new area, so there'll be a lot of developments down that path.
All right, so Ron, in the about half an hour that I've known you, I've been very excited to ask you a question as well. So
I can't wait to hear what you have to ask.
All right, so the question for you, Ron. So as we see states and regulatory agencies try to react to these new federal guidelines, we're starting to see the different approaches, and they're often conflicting.
Yeah.
So what do you recommend as we try to navigate this new landscape?
Yeah, so I think for many of them, they're open to a discussion or dialogue. Like even with the SEC ruling, there were long periods of conversation to finally distill it down to what we actually ended up with. So if you can recall, like there were other requirements that were being proposed within that, and then it boiled down to what we contend with today. So you have to have people on your team that are helping you and helping connect with the various policymakers, the various regulatory authorities, in order to get them to kind of see what's practical, what can work, and what can we do to get to a better place. We should try to steer them to a path of harmonization. And sometimes when I go international, harmonization is this awful word. So you're trying to prevent regulatory fragmentation. Just know where you are when you say your words. There are many regulators and governments that see that all of the varying standards create kind of a problem. I was talking with David Koh, who leads the Cybersecurity agency out of Singapore, and he's like, Ron, we just came up with our own cybersecurity policy and standards that businesses have to adopt. And I said, yeah, that's great. And he's like, well, what's wrong with that? I said, you're going to tell me it's 80% of the other stuff that I do. Yeah, it is about 80% of the stuff that you do. And it's not always 80% of the stuff that you do. So it's 80% of the stuff that you do. I said, Dave, that 20%, like you do that 20% like 100 times, that 20% kind of hurts. He's like, oh, I get it. So there are organizations that will listen. I will also tell you that there are agencies that don't listen, and I've been in conversations where they like being different, and they're different. It's what makes them better and more special. So you got to try to help them help us. So that's one thing. Participate, be there, and then you have to have a team that can analyze the set of requirements that you now face. Compliance is not security. Making sure you can tick a box doesn't mean that you are secure. But you have to focus on the controls and make the controls strong enough that no matter what the compliance regime that you face, here's the new requirement. The controls allow me to tick the box that I need to tick. So you have to be thoughtful about that. You have to have a team that can take it and distill finding the common denominator or the highest standard of the requirement. So with notifications, you have varying. It varies across the globe. So you have to take in the lowest common denominator or the highest standard because, say we go public with a notification that we have to make in, say, India, because there's like an hour requirement there. If it also affects the United States, you don't think they're going to be pissed that, hey, why'd you tell India and why'd you tell them first? Well, because they required an hour. That's not going to help. So you got to think about how to make all of that work so that you can simplify as best you can your reporting requirements or your compliance requirements to make it less impactful for your teams. If your teams have to, okay, today I got to think about New York. I got to think about New York because I'm being asked about New York, and so I got to think about these things differently. Tomorrow I got to think about how GDPR is affecting me, so I got to answer these questions differently. You make more work for the business, so simplify your control ownership and the controls in a way that when it comes to checking the box for compliance, you just make it as simple as you can for the teams that actually have to do the response work.
That's good advice. I actually want to have one closing question, but to each of you, and just kind of get your thoughts on what your best advice is for anyone out there who's concerned or curious or confused about what these new regulations mean for them. So let's go ahead and start with you, Adam.
So a lot of it, I think Ron covered, which is you've got to keep up with it or follow someone who does keep up with it. And there's a lot of news and a lot you have to do in the day. So whether that means reading client alerts from law firms or the like, you don't want to be caught by surprise when something drops. There is an opportunity to influence regulations, as you said. So I think you have to strike a balance between taking a look at what you're currently doing and how you might have to change it if a new regulation comes into effect without running hither and fro like a chicken before the regulation's actually finalized. You might need to give some thought to segmenting your business. I think it is possible there won't be a common denominator. That's the ideal world, but I think you actually could be caught in between a rock and a hard place between, say, Europe and the US or China and the US or different jurisdictions or different states. And you might have to make judgment calls about, say, if you do federal procurement, that business may operate under a different set of rules from other parts of your business. And that's probably not news to a lot of folks in the room who already do that.
Yeah. Chris?
I would say hire a good law firm like Adams to do No, I mean, in all seriousness, like you have to keep up with all the different regulations that are out there as a business. So having a resource that can help you do that, I think is really important. I mean, frankly, that's what my team and like my colleague Jason Olson is in the audience who works for me, and that's kind of what we do for AT&T in the Washington office, working with a lot of lawyers and other parties. But I do think that really keeping up with what's happening is really important. The government is going to be. We're moving into a new paradigm, right? It's a new world now. It's not going to be as much of a partnership. They're moving more towards, yeah, we'll trust you, but you got to prove it kind of model. So I think while they'll still be a partnership, and the government will still work with industry, they're going to want companies to demonstrate that they have strong security programs. There's going to be requirements for more attestations and other forms of validation, right? Whereas before maybe they took our word for it. Now it's going to be more trust and validate type of model. And so all companies that are in that situation situation, doing business with the government, from a procurement perspective, or operating in critical infrastructure, certainly need to be aware of that and keep up to speed with that however best they can, whether that means they have in-house resources to do that or they bring in outside counsel or other firms to help them do that. But I think that's going to be a critical need going forward.
Yeah, I just had a flashback to one of our CEOs saying, look, if you're not at the dinner table talking about it, then you're what's for dinner. So participating in events like this, commiserating with other security officers or policy wonks at your different companies, staying aligned within your sector. If you can go cross-sector, that's awesome too, so that you can find like the voice that can help persuade a direction that's helpful to the cause. And then also sharing some of the thoughts or ideas, or this is how we're going to approach it, so that when different authorities come and check, this is how we're doing it. Well, we're doing it the way that others are actually doing it. One of the things that we've done within the financial service sector is come up with the financial service sector profile. It's a security standard. Well, it really isn't. I consider it like a blob. This is what it professes to be a standard, but it actually eats other standards. Yeah. So it's actually not. It wasn't created on its own. It was actually created to. All right, let me take ISO and then let me put NIST in it. So it just accumulates. Like if you watch the movie The Blob, it just absorbs stuff. So it just absorbs these things. So and we're actually making traction with our regulators, like the cloud work we're doing with them. They're looking at, well, how can we use a cloud profile? And that would make it, for us, they're leveraging a standard that actually, well, if they thought NIST was great, well, this is NIST. Oh, I thought ISO was great. Well, this is ISO. It is. So there are things that we can do together to make it easier for them to do what they need to us.
All right, we're at time. I want to really thank all of you, the panelists here. Give them a big round of applause. Thank you, guys. Enjoy the rest of the conference.